Hey,
Hi, everyone.
hey,
Hey. Let's just wait a couple of minutes for people to join. We will likely begin at 9:05.
If anybody has any other topics or anything,
Oh, yeah.
we only have two up there right now. Well, one highlight.
Yeah.
Um,
Feel free to add any topics you're interested in discussing.
Hope you don't mind, Christian. I went ahead and just threw that on there.
So it's been 9:05, so I think let's just get started. So first, quickly go over the two highlights we currently have. The first is related to recent spec change. We add the namespace not empty exception to the spec, and now the response code is 449. Thanks, Edward, for driving light. And also the second highlight is thanks, Alex, for adding the auth manager. Really appreciate. So yeah, let's begin for the discussion. I understand the first should be related to the new events endpoint discussion in that thread. Christian, do you want to give us a bit more details about that?
Sure. I was just reading through the last minute comments. Yeah, sure. So I think we have discussed like this topic already a little bit also last year, where we discussed the notifications endpoint that is now part of Polaris as one way to implement federation. And well, back then I already mentioned that maybe like a pull-based approach would be nicer for a few reasons, for a number of reasons. And well, this is where this proposal is basically coming from. So in this proposal, we introduce an events endpoint, which basically is an event log of all the changes that happened in a specific warehouse. And using this endpoint, because we have done all the different changes provided by this one endpoint, it's quite easy to implement, well, catalog federation basically on it, which I think is one of the main use cases for this endpoint. Apart from federation, I do see also two other use cases that I also mentioned in the document. One is that if we have a changes endpoint, it's quite easy for any kind of external system to actually listen to changes and then react on them if they occur, because we have a pointer basically that we can follow. So it's easy to as an external stakeholder basically to follow what's going on. And then we have also a third use case, which is, I think this also supports a little bit like smaller audit use cases. This is not a full audit log because we don't log queries, and I don't think we want to in this endpoint. Those are just the changes, but having the changes available is also good for auditing. Let's put it that way. Yeah, so those are, I guess, the main three use cases. And based on these three use cases, I also designed the filters. I think like if we got rid of some of them and say, well, this is maybe not part of the scope, we could also have a little bit leaner filtering there. Yeah, so I guess this much for the introduction. I think a few things that we should discuss first is, do we want this? I've already put a long list of alternatives in there. How federation could be done alternatively. A few of them have been discussed before. For example, query through federation. I think there was a discussion already almost 2 years ago with Jack was included. I'm not sure who else was. So there are other alternatives. However, what this endpoint differentiates from all the others is that it's handling multiple tables basically at the same time. So everything else would be query through, would require query through, or ETAG-based polling is only for one table, so it would require a lot of requests actually implemented. So I guess the first question is, it's not a small endpoint. Like, is it worth it? Worth following up? So just, I guess, some opportunities or opinions from the community would be nice here. And after that, of course, we can dig into the design. We already had a few discussions going on with, or in the document. Yeah, I guess maybe that's a good way forward.
I'll start. I actually like it, but for all of the reasons that you listed as like secondary reasons, more than I like it for federation. I think everybody has been interested for a long time in getting like changes from the catalog, understanding what's mutating for triggers and airflow, for all the reasons that people want information about what's mutating in the catalog. That's always very difficult to get, and people have created polling mechanisms and things that put a lot of pressure on the catalog to address those kind of things. So I really like the events from that. I think it can be used in terms of federation, to kind of like try and keep the state up to date. But I think we should also look at, all of the options that you put out there don't actually seem like distinctly different options. They actually look like things that you could combine together to build a better federated mechanism, which would be, hey, I'm using the event log to kind of keep the Rust state. I'm using E tags when somebody does a load to see if it's current. And I'm, reading through if it's not current because like either my event processing or, the E tag could end up failing and I actually want to load the current data. And then the harder problem is actually like if you want full federation, including commits, then like read through is probably the only option, because if that is the owning catalog, it's the only one that can formally do the commit. And so like the question is really, well, what are we scoping for federation? And then if we want to actually accommodate the push based, could we also make the event endpoint like take updates in the way that the notification endpoint? I'm not sure that we necessarily want to do that, but you could be able to use it kind of like I see Ryan's reaction. So, but like, we had discussed like the opposite, which is the push base, which we're telling the catalog, hey, I made this change. I see in this world like that, like supporting both of those could be really conflicting. Like that could get bad, especially if you're talking about like, hey, we want to federate over the same tables and like somebody's committing over there and we're committing over here and we're pushing, you get into operation issues very quickly. So I think I actually like the events most for the other use cases. I'm not sure, other than optimizing how you would do a query through, I'm not sure how much I love it from just like a federation standpoint.
Yeah. Okay. Very nice. Glad to hear. And I think it's also something that doesn't exclude, right? So actually both endpoints can be there. Dennis?
Yeah, actually, I was gonna say that is that interesting. I mean, I also agree about I think the coexistence, but in a way, I also think that the federation that still means it's useful for the federation use case. Like in general, I'm also +1 on this proposal. I like it. One observation is when we talk about the pull based and push based, we are kind of talking about two different ends of the federator. So like if we're talking about the receiving notification endpoint, we're talking about the facade catalog, right? As the destination, as the sink. And then in this case, we're talking about events being published from the source catalog, the source of truth catalog, because either one also somewhat has a counterpart. Like if we're talking about with push-based ones, oftentimes the conversation goes into the realm of saying, okay, well, what about how does the source catalog help support notification-based things? And then that's where we get into the world of like talking about subscribers and that's where things get very complicated, and that's part of why I also like this proposal, right? Like it's a great starting point as something to put on the source catalog without fully trying to rebuild the whole pub subsystem entirely, right? Without trying to keep subscriber state and just like that would be extremely complicated. And I also agree that like I think we've been looking at this, like some stakeholders like Snowflake are certainly interested in using this as a supplement to other mechanisms for federation, including flavors of query through. And I guess to that end, it's interesting because what this means is that the facade catalog, whatever thing is trying to sync its state to the source catalog, in order to query this events endpoint, we'll already need to have like a connection configuration of some sort, right? Like it will need credentials to reach into this, which I guess is good. It means it's also like inline. It's aligned. It's a stepping stone to being able to pull these events, and then it now has a connection that maybe can be used for pass through of mutations. But then I think to that end, I am curious a little bit about like if we would intend for this to be sort of transactionally consistent, like immediately consistent, like to have a strong definition of consistency, as in, for example, never seeing sequence numbers go backwards, all right? And because that would be a prerequisite for being able to say whether this events API is by itself a trustworthy way to reconstruct the source of truth, even if you didn't do a load table, like you didn't do a query through.
Right.
Yeah, so it is definitely a choice that we could make to say that you have to assign sequence numbers to every event and provide them in order and make certain guarantees about it. I think the problem with that is it's not something that you would be able to do for many cases. So like, I don't know that that would work for like a distributed catalog that is pushing these events to Kafka and then pulling them back from Kafka to, you know, show them to the user or something like that. I think that the way I envision this is your sequence number could roughly be server timestamp, as long as your server timestamp is in a distributed system is like reasonably up to date with NTP, right? And you know, I would not want to require strong guarantees there because it makes it so that services can't provide this endpoint, basically.
Yeah.
So, like, I think my take on this is a little bit different. Let me try to explain it. So, I thought about this a lot actually, and I agree that this is currently not very easy to implement. However, so a catalog always needs to have, so not necessarily on, so currently our events are, one event is one table update, right? If we go one level up, we have a transaction. So we would have multiple table updates sent to the commit endpoint and basically being processed all together. So I was thinking about how to design this endpoint, if it should be on a commit level, if one row should be one commit or one row should be one table update. That's, I think, another discussion. But let's assume we go out from event-based, like from single table update to transaction. Then a catalog must have a global order in which these transactions actually happen, because otherwise, I mean, let's say we have a distributed catalog and table A is, okay, you disagree? You can tell me.
Well, the only order in a transaction is that these two tables or however many tables were modified at the same time, and you have ordering between the modifications to those tables themselves. But between transaction A and transaction B on completely different tables, there is no ordering.
Yeah, and I would say that like that I actually don't consider that a huge problem, because we have a transaction commit endpoint, and all you actually need to do is associate a transaction ID with all the tables that were involved in that commit, and we just need to provide that ID in the events endpoint. So even though they could be separate table events, they'd have the same transaction ID.
I don't get the point. Maybe let me ask another question. So let's say we have like in every single transaction that happens to a catalog, table A is part of that in some order. In one transaction, you're right, it all happens in a way, but every transaction that we do has table A in it. Now, if we assume that every transaction went through, then every change was processed in a certain order for table A. So we kind of have a global order of transactions, right? First, this was applied, then this was applied, because otherwise, the second transaction or some transaction would have failed.
That's a special case where, because all of the transactions interacted with table A, you have a total ordering of transactions.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if
not necessarily.
Yeah. In fact, I mean, this was exactly what part of, because we started thinking about what it would take to implement in Polaris, and it like in theory, it's like the trivial way is that you take a global lock, right? Like if you can global lock and have at a catalog level, right, and essentially it is possible, and you can try to like somewhat optimize it and still have like a catalog level versioning, which is, this is actually very apt for, because there's other catalogs like Nestle which have catalog level versioning, and it could in theory be something that people opt into. But like when we start thinking about the implementation details, like it happens to also be very apt because Polaris is undergoing some soul searching about its persistence layer right now as well, and there are somewhat two flavors, right? Like that in a world where you are willing to sort of like rely on like database level transactions to do your Iceberg thing. Like at this point, not even worrying about like Iceberg multi-table transactions, just talking about single table. In concept, like the catalog itself could be a very soft container, as in like independent tables can function completely independently. Like they can be in different row ranges in a NoSQL database that do not conflict when you're updating these. And even if you have server timestamps, but like the servers could have arbitrary skew if you allow it, and then like you don't actually have like a well-defined ordering between things in those two different tables. So in this case, it is one of those things though where like 99% good enough is sort of a fundamentally different flavor than strictly consistent. So that is something where we'd have to think about is like, and that last 1% does change the flavor a lot, right? Because it's like 99%. Yeah, you have like your clock. You make your clocks all synced to the I forgot the name of the standard, whatever, right? And then use your server time and call it a day. The last 1% means maybe a global lock, but which I'm that said, I'm not necessarily against it. It seems like if it could have that flavor, it would be very useful, and if it's something that people could opt into knowingly, it would make it so that it's possible to reconstruct a state. But I guess it's true that not every catalog could implement it easily.
So okay, okay, I agree, like we don't want this global lock. This is also why I've put in there that, okay, but maybe actually this already introduces this problem that while we need a chronological order of points, it is okay to have gaps. So you basically can assign ID blocks to different executors if tables are shared, and then if tables are separated or in different charts of the catalog or something, and still solve this. However, I agree that we probably shouldn't have this last 1%. The question is how we can make it work reasonably, I guess. Like what would be a sequence? First of all, do we need an after sequence at all? We already have pagination, right, in place. I added the after sequence to the filter because the sequence actually, or the timestamp or whatever we decide on, has a meaning to the client, right? It has a semantic meaning. So it's okay that because the client actually gets the sequence, it might want to continue from that sequence with a different filter, which is why I didn't like the just provide the next page token, but wanted to have the sequence in here as well. So I don't think we can make it completely opaque because clients want to change the filter. But what we could, of course, do is change the type from an int to something else and remove some guarantees in the wording, I guess. I think, Maninda, you were first.
So I was saying that could we have the spec more permissive where spec does not dictate the implementation like locking or whatnot? Can the catalog provide guarantees that, these orderings, they would be strictly like they are strict ordering guarantees, or they are not so strict ordering guarantees, they are best effort things, and then the clients can make a decision based off that?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, we can introduce that information. I think, however, it's enough if the catalog maybe then documents it somewhere else. So in its documentation, the guarantees that it provides. Ryan?
In terms of problems, I think it's easy to go around and around on some of these things. Like like you were saying, what happens if we have filters? What happens if we, want to change the filters and still have I think what we should do is come up with the semantics of the events that you provide through this, without respect to filters, and then define how to apply filters on that sequence of events. That way we're really just talking about a single event log, and you can have different views of it. So I would probably table both pagination and filtering until we get the guarantees that can or should be provided by the event log sort of nailed down. For those, I would take kind of the approach that I think Maninder was talking about, which is a reasonable lag or delay. Like you're probably the ability to dedupe events if you have them. So like each event should probably have a unique ID that identifies it, and a way to ensure that you have some total picture of the events themselves in the order that they happened, right? And the order guarantees must be like, if table A was changed twice, you get the events in the order that table A was changed, and guarantees basically like that. Dan?
Yeah, I'm getting a little concerned that we're like focusing so much on trying to provide stronger and stronger guarantees, but we know we can never achieve full consistency. And so like, I don't want to put so much emphasis on it that we like lure ourselves into a false sense of security around using this event log because, we have like this perfect ordering. But we like, if you actually want consistency, you still need to do like an e-tag check or a load from the original table. So like other than providing, allowing the catalog to define its guarantees, like pushing that onto the implementation and saying, hey, if you want exact ordering or total ordering or something like that, we'll provide a way for you to tell clients, or you can just like add it to your documentation, but we don't need to define that as part of the spec. We don't need to put that burden on all the catalogs, because in most cases, like the difference is negligible in terms of how we are actually going to use this.
But Dan, wouldn't you say that there's also some requirement here? Because if you have two changes to a table, you don't necessarily want to process them out of order.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I would say that the idea there is that in any sort of like local minimum, like a table operation, you need to provide those in order so they can be consumed correctly. Like even something like an airflow trigger is going to get messed up if you switch the order of events for a table, right? Mm-hmm. Something like that could have an impact, but like the global ordering, like how different events happen, like I don't think that we need to be too strong about those things. Agreed. And say like, you need to provide these kind of like guarantees. Like we can isolate to the things that actually matter, which is like for a specific table, the ordering. Maybe for a transaction that involves multiple tables, we may have to say something like, hey, you need to provide those in some way that you can associate them, like a transaction ID or something like that, if you care about it. But yeah, I wouldn't go too far down the path of like trying to get strong guarantees here when we know like we're always going to be lagging because we're pulling this event log to go and get updates.
Agree, Dennis?
Yeah, about the consistency, I think that there are actually, I see two different possible elements here. One is, consistency in time about like, okay, do I have the latest table so that I can do a mutation? And that's true. Like you got to load table. Either way, you're committing with the requirements that show the previous one. I think the other aspect though is about like, even if it's not up to date in time, even if you're lagging, can you reason about like your cursor, essentially, right? Can you say that my cursor is actually safe? I think it's a slightly different thing, right? Than real-time consistency. What you're saying is like, if I strictly ever advance my cursor and I never go backwards, what do I have to do to know that I've 100% reconstructed the state as of some point in time in the future, in the past of the cat? As in, like, what do I have to do to make sure I never miss anything, so that I have eventual consistency? Even if I'm lagging, can I just increment my cursor? And it is possible. I typed in the chat a little bit. Like, it feels a little bit like there are probably modes that, or semantics that we should have defined, even if we're not saying that they're the requirement for this event, or even if we're explicitly saying that this is not what this events API does. And I'll admit, maybe I don't know off the top of my head if there's already like sort of an academic formulation, because this feels a lot similar, very similar to like trying to define isolation semantics in a database now, but in a different, just like in a different space, right? Because like these patterns seem pretty usual, like having a window of time where things, your timestamp still might fall within this epsilon. It's kind of like the TCP windowing, and like there must be some standard vernacular, and if not, we should probably put the we should be able to express in terms of those, if for no other reason than to say that we're not doing strict ordering.
What we're talking about, though, is like effectively a bin log from like a Postgres database or a MySQL database. Like we're tracking the change. Now, maybe not to the fidelity that they do and everything like that, but we're creating an event stream of changes that are happening against the catalog.
Right.
I mean, I think that there is probably some prior art that we can go look at and see, like, hey, what kind of terminology do you use? What kind of requirements do they have? Those are probably even stronger than what I would say we need for this. But there are parallels out there. I don't think that this is new ground that we're paving by any means. I don't know. First.
Only thing is, like, this is not write ahead log, right? So this is something we are saying that the log would be consistent if you are reading it in order, but it's not a it's not that your commit would be successful only if you guarantee writing to that log. Like, where are we drawing that boundary?
So I was talking about bin log, which comes after the fact. So as opposed to write ahead log, which is part of the actual transaction processing, right?
Got it.
So I don't think we're trying to get in the path of the actual commit here. Nobody has suggested anything like that, where it's like, oh, I have to acknowledge something before the catalog can actually, commit those operations.
So to be clear, that was the design we were trying to figure out how to build in Polaris, is block the true commit. Like the true commit has to be in the same bulk update or backend database transaction as the event table commit, which is what makes it hard.
So I think that we really need to relax these constraints, just like Dan was saying. I would push back on the idea of calling out specific isolation levels, right? Like, sure, you could build snapshot isolation if you had like a total ordering of these events and things like that, but we don't all agree on isolation levels in the first place. Like, every database has its own definition of isolation levels. So, and I really do think that when we get down to what capabilities we're going to want to build with this, it's going to be very different. So I think probably the best path forward is to define the guarantees that your system provides for this, right? Make sure that we have reasonable requirements for like deduplication and like, hey, don't have events show up in an unreasonable time in the past. But I don't think that in order to move forward with the events endpoint, we should care much about consistency, right? It is almost certainly going to be subject to problems, right? Like, if you're a very reasonable choice, for instance, is we lazily log after a commit happens, right? This is going to be, you know, to your point, Dennis, 99% reliable, if not far more reliable. Yet we don't want to make the guarantee that that log definitely happens and that you have, you know, some total ordering of events, because we don't want to put it in the critical path for committing, right? It's a very reasonable choice to say, I'm not going to do a two-phase commit and have this in the critical path. So if it's not in the critical path, we cannot make, you know, hard guarantees about that. Let alone considering all the systems where REST is a pass-through to Hive or, you know, something like that. I think the best thing that we can do is say that, you know, you must guarantee the ordering of changes for a given table or a given object, you know, that you're not going to have events forward or backward in time, and that, you know, you will make a reasonable effort to order events properly so that you don't drop events by needing to go back 10 pages in the output.
I think that the back 10 pages sounds interesting though, because like once we actually try to think like what constitutes a reasonable amount of backwardsness, like this is where, you know, this is like ordered within epsilon. Like this is like, do we formulate that well, or like do we just sort of say it's best effort?
I think it has to be best effort, because if you think about the challenges that we've all been dealing with like Kafka pipelines, taking in, you know, bin log, CDC, like we're exactly trying to do that. And I don't know anyone who makes, you know, perfect reliability guarantees about their CDC pipelines, right? You're always in this state where, you know, you might have to go verify your table every few months. Right, that's the cost of doing this sort of thing.
And that's why I actually, like, going back to the token thing, like I would prefer we just use an opaque token, because that allows the backend service to just like, hey, the naive service is using a single database and they're using a database timestamp, and that's good enough for them to order their events, right? For more complicated databases, they can do something more complicated, and as long as you can provide the token, just like we do pagination everywhere else, you know, all of those have the same considerations for, you know, what if you're using a backing store that doesn't provide, you know, lexicographical ordering for listing? Well, okay, you can develop your own implementation for that. Just state what your guarantees are and try and be reasonable about what you provide.
This is for kicking off jobs and for mirroring state, not for transactional consistency.
Yeah, I think for the mirroring state, that makes sense for how load table and update table interact. That, you know, you kind of just have to pass through, or you say that this is just an optimization. I think that there are some edge cases around drops and renames, which become kind of important. So you know, one question is, would we make sure we don't miss an event or a drop? Like, is the event queue, you know, reliable for detecting that you have to wipe out something, even if it's just eventually, like if it's going to eventually be there? And it could be as simple as, even if we do it after a commit, it's sort of like, as long as you promise to retry forever to put that drop into your event log, then maybe it's okay. But because that's something where it's you don't expect necessarily a future query to help you discover the fact that the table is dropped, and maybe you have some, you know, cached things at your facade, you know, your federation facade, and you're saying, and you need to know that it was deleted. And then there's subtleties with how to detect renames, but I think that one is harder to think about. So maybe just on drops, right? Like,
yeah. So like from my side, first of all, Daniel, I absolutely agree that we should use an opaque token. Then for most use cases, I used an integer mainly because it's like a little bit more efficient, limited in length and things like that. But it even allows gaps now, which is similar to a cursor. But I'm also like, we could change this to a string and then the sequence. I mean, string ordering is a problem, which is why I don't. Second reason why I didn't use the string there. So we would have to define that string a little bit better, because if we want this cursor, this opaque cursor, to kind of be sortable in a way, I think we should at least like try and give this kind of guarantee. Or you were just talking about the next page token, right?
Yeah. So why would we need it to be sortable though?
Because the sequence itself has a meaning to the client. So if you get a number of events, like if it's a timestamp, even if it's not 100% guaranteed and so on, then if you have a bunch of events that you get back, you want them sorted in a way. There is information basically in the sequence number, which is why I think it should be sortable.
Well, I do think there's a difference between the token itself and the ordering, because like in the response, the server can say these are ordered, you know, based on wherever that opaque token is, right? It comes back as an ordered response. We wouldn't expect a client to reshuffle events that is received as a list. So the ordering from the opaque token should be preserved. And then you're just using like the next token to go get the next batch. Like I shouldn't know anything about the token itself. And each event shouldn't necessarily have something, because we can't guarantee an ordering of the events unless the catalog is saying, like, I will guarantee, but then I just provide them back in the guaranteed order.
Well, yes. What would be possible then, I guess, is like, which is currently we have both, right? In the proposal, we have an after sequence, but we also have a next page token. The next page token is opaque. The after sequence is not, in the case that, you know, folks want to switch filters, for example, or stuff, yeah, things like that. Basically, it has like the order for me has a semantic meaning, and this is why I tried to add it to this field. Yeah, so that
I mean, you could potentially, like, a server could populate that with something, you know, meaningless within the context of the response that you can sort on. But we're already providing back an ordered list, right? And so I would lean into opaque and the ordered response in terms of determining the order. That way we don't have like some other thing, because like you also don't want to have like two separate queries with two separate filters, and then the client is trying to interleave these things with some sort of like ordering. Like that doesn't make sense to me. You should go and re-request with the, you know, the correct filter and get things in an ordered response.
I agree with that. That's what I raised my hand to say. Like there is no ordering across different filters. Like why are we trying to have an ordering across different filters? If you are looking for a certain set of changes, then like you shouldn't be changing your filters within that operation, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I can live with that. Yeah.
But I think we've still basically said though that even if the client side uses the returned you know, cursor tokens perfectly and just like keeps it, we're saying like you'll fundamentally drop. You'll have something where you for some reason missed an event, right? Where we're essentially saying that your cursor is not a comprehensive view of all events. Not only like some events might never make it into your event list because of the database commit failed, and other events might have gotten inserted. Like the next person who uses the same ordering of cursors to go through everything will see more than you saw, or may see more than what you saw the first time you did your cursor through it. Right? That's what we're saying by saying that there's no ordering guarantees.
Dan, I think you were next.
Yeah, I was going to change the topic just a little bit, though. So like, I don't know, were you going to respond to that, Ryan?
Yeah, I mean, there will always be, because we must allow different backends, different guarantees here. And we aren't necessarily going to have a two-phase commit or like a transactional, I mean, right? You have to deal with like, however I'm logging this event and however I'm updating the state of the table are almost certainly not the same thing, right? Maybe you're producing these things off of the write-ahead log of your database, in which case, good for you. That's a little too far. Like, I don't think I would ever implement it that way. So like, almost certainly you're going to have a case where you make a commit and then you asynchronously log it, and that node could just fail, right? That node could die immediately, and you don't know that the table state changed. So there will be cases in, very rare cases, but there will be cases where you did not get the logged event. I think that we should not optimize for driving those cases to 0 or a minimum in the protocol, but like, how do we design for that 99% solution where things generally work and you have, a reasonable amount of resiliency here, which is like, you have like a Kafka queue and you log to that Kafka queue afterwards, and then you take those Kafka events and you dump them to S3 in some order, and then you read from S3. Like, that would be a perfectly reasonable way to implement this thing. And in that case, right, you're probably going to have some ordering guarantees that are dependent on your logging system, which would be like basically the order of consuming from all of those Kafka offsets. And the order would be dependent, like we really can't make many guarantees here, I guess. But you need to document what the order guarantees are, say when you may see out of order events, compared to what you got the last time. So if you keep hitting the events endpoint, right, do you know that new events will only come at the end of the list? Maybe. I would honestly just have IDs on the events so you can deduplicate. Sorry, that was a lot.
String ID?
Oh, big ID.
I would say string ID, require that events be in the order that they occurred for a single table. And call out your requirements or your guarantees from the service for late arriving events, which could be like after 5 minutes, late arriving events don't arrive.
So I'll pivot off that to ask my other question, which is, how do we seed the initial state? And like, if you get out of that like window of retention, like, how do I then get my federated copy up to a current state? Like, are we just saying that's up to the implementation? You could crawl the existing APIs. You could, like, how do we go from 0 to 1? Out of scope. Well, I mean, like, I think we need to, like, if we're saying, hey, here's an approach to do federation, and you can start at any time and you'll just start receiving events, and it's like, oh, I see events that are like this table is committed to. Like, what do I do? Do I start like saturating my catalog? What are we recommending to people to do federate?
So the longer we talk about this, like, my idea going forward would be because like, if we don't have this kind of sequence number, I think what would be very helpful to add instead is a timestamp, right? So if a certain client wants to get events after a certain timestamp, roughly, like including a little bit of overlap. And in that case, this is my way from 0 to 1, right? So I start crawling the catalog today. It takes a week, I don't know, hopefully less. I remember today, maybe minus 10 minutes, and this is when I start getting events.
I would say it's out of scope for 2 reasons. One, like, you can easily come up with a strategy like Christian is talking about. right, for syncing. We already have this sort of problem. Two, there are use cases that don't require a full sync from the event log. So like if you're just saying like, hey, I want to start consuming these events and driving airflow from it, cool. We don't really need to care about backfill in order to make this thing valuable. I also have an idea for how I would sync state, which is it would be super nice to have a way to dump your catalog state, which would be like a list of objects and a list of metadata locations for them. And that's just a thing that you can always get in order to move between catalogs. And, you know, like that's, I think, what users really want in order to have this no lock-in idea. Like at any time, I can dump the state of my catalog to a well-known, you know, CSV file even, and put that into another catalog. But I do think that that's a separate proposal and a separate endpoint.
Okay, I can buy that. Like there are many use cases that don't require existing state, right? Triggers, you know, alerting, like all that kind of stuff does not require prior state. And then state can either be handled CSV, yeah, dump CSV. Okay, so I don't know what Falco was talking about.
I suggested this is a CSV file.
Okay, so for then populating initial state, like we can either punt that to a future endpoint, or you can say you can crawl the catalog to try and, you know, get up to whatever the current state is. Right now, I think we would probably just recommend crawl the catalog to get current state if you are doing federation through this. And then the state endpoint is something that we could define separately.
Yeah.
Yufei, thanks for being patient. Sorry. Well,
No, it's yeah. I was just trying to talk about the individual objects of the ordering. I think it's still pretty hard to guarantee unless we use the object itself, like table has this sequence number or timestamp itself, then it's somehow guaranteed, because if we use the catalog level of whatever catalog implementations, then everything happens synchronized when you log their events, right? Then it's still potentially there's two instances, and the update events happens in different order, even they are in like compared to the original order within that table transaction guarantee. Then if we grab the metadata from that table, then we can potentially order them. That's kind of put burden onto the catalog implementation side. Say, okay, we want a catalog implementation to guarantee that. I'm not sure we want to put that guarantee on our protocol. I guess we don't. Otherwise, you potentially there's one implementation does not order that, does not do that implementation, then it becomes a problem that all these clients just assume there's ordering for even this individual object, that it doesn't provide any ordering. And another topics I'm thinking, because this is best effort ordering. So yeah, especially Danny's talking about delete and the renames. So how much useful in that case? Because we probably have to do the load table anyways in that case. So make sure we actually get the source of truth instead of the false event or out of the order event. So for audit use case, I'm pretty sure it's very useful. You can always use this thing, even log for audits. But for the federation, it's still like how much guarantee we can provide to the client side. Yeah, I was a little bit confusing that part. If not a question used for, it's still fine. Like if we have strict, like 90% of the use case, we have this notification say this table has been updated, that table updated. But every time you do the update, you still have to make sure it is the update.
I think that you're right in calling this out. We probably cannot even provide a guarantee that the events for a given table are in order. But what we might be able to do is have a way to detect out of order events. So for instance, when we commit in, the library, we do have sequence numbers and even like the version number that we stuff inside the file name that would allow us to at least, provide some ordering of events on a table. Now those don't have, the rename and other operations. But like there is a way to provide some like guarantee there so that at least these events are idempotent, right? This table was updated at this time. Here is the current state. If you missed all the other events for that table, that doesn't matter because you have the current state. You can detect changes.
Okay, but now I think we are in a little conundrum, because before we said that actually we don't like that we don't want a global ordering, right? That we would just basically depend on the next page token to get the next number of events. But now when this next page of events could contain out of order events, then we would need a global ordering in a way, wouldn't we? Or would a rough timestamp be enough for that?
Or do you miss the events entirely, right? And I think that this is where I think it will be important for us to think through the common implications of the non-goals. Like if we say it's not on the, if we're not going to say the catalog doesn't have to implement it, I think we do need to do the due diligence of coming up with the implications. Like one example would be, suppose somebody says they need to be wipeout compliant for wiping out data, and some tables are archival and they're never read or updated otherwise. Is it sufficient? Like in what work? Like is there any way to use the events API? Like maybe going back in the cursor, like recursoring through. Like is there any way to use it such that they are wipeout compliant, or is it impossible to build wipeout compliance?
So I think
that is the current state of the catalog in order to get to a source of truth periodically.
Right. So we'd say like so we should document, right? Essentially the events API is just like, think of it as a best effort cache of anything, and for source of truth you really have to reconcile against the whole catalog. And I think that it's fine if that's the outcome, right? That we can document it well, and then that's okay.
So what happened to like we letting the catalogs defining their best effort or kind of strict guarantees? Like should we, like I do agree, like we don't need to make it too complicated. Best effort is probably the way to start. But should we at least allow the catalogs to express the guarantees that it wants to provide on the events?
Does it need to be machine readable though, or is it enough in the documentation of the catalog to read it there? So do we need to build it into the protocol or not? I guess that's the question here.
I think that the protocol should call it out as best effort. And if you have higher guarantees, you can it's up to you to like be okay with whatever guarantees that you get, right? If you're reconstructing state and you want to hit a secondary catalog for queries, to Dan's earlier point, you're always going to have like out of date queries unless you have a read through.
No, like out of date is one thing, but usually on secondaries you can still say, I am snapshot isolation compatible, which is like a certain lag is acceptable.
I think with the controlled environments, for example, if you have all these clients are under your control, these clients can leverage these kind of guarantee, then that's fine. Otherwise, you cannot, right? Because this client can talk to any catalog implementations.
I would definitely not start off with trying to define the types of guarantees that that are available, or like trying to enforce this in the protocol at all. I would say the best thing is probably just to like standardize it if and when we have catalogs that have behaviors to standardize. And until then, make sure that it is known as a best effort thing.
Right,
Okay.
thanks guys. Yeah, so I'm sorry I'm calling like a hard stop because it's already like 10 a.m. so we are out of time. Thanks everyone for the like some discussion about the event. I recommend we keep the discussion in the design doc and the dev list. I will upload the recording to the YouTube very soon. Thank you very much for joining this meeting. See you
Maybe
next time.
one last point. Should we, like, I'm going to work on a second version of this. Should I do it in this document or create a copy?
No,
Yeah,
go
we
ahead
can always
and
look at history.
Oh, we can look at history. Okay, then I'll just edit this document to our liking and then send the changes. Okay, thanks. Sorry, Jonas.
Bye, guys.
Bye.